Welcome to Times Online exclusive interviews. Today we have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Nishan de Mel, Executive Director, Verite Research, a think tank providing strategic analysis for Asia on areas of political, economic, law and media. Dr. de Mel, to start off, could you please explain the exchange rate crisis and the factors that added to it?
Yeah. So what we call the exchange rate crisis in Sri Lanka has two aspects to it. One, and they're connected. One is that there is a shortage of dollars. Mm-hmm. So people who want to import, people who want to go out of the country, pay bills that are outside the country, are unable to find dollars to do that. Okay. And I'll come back to tell you why that is. Mm-hmm. But of course, when there's a shortage, the price gets bid up. Yeah. So whenever there's a shortage of anything, people start to bid a higher price for it. So a dollar that people may previously have bought at 200, as long as there's a shortage, they're willing to pay 210. If there's a shortage at 210, they'll pay 220. Mm-hmm. And it's gone up to even 250, 260 in the informal market. That's true. Now, so the fundamental question is, why is there a shortage? Yeah. And why is the price getting bid up in the informal market? That's okay. Right. So there is a shortage because an economy, like any ecosystem, is maintained in balance. And when Sri Lanka in the past was paying debt, it was able to borrow dollars so that it didn't have a large reduction in the dollar reserves or stocks when it paid back the debt that it had. So there was a certain balance. You paid and you borrowed. And there was a medium-term framework in the central bank published by them that saw it as important to reduce foreign debt and thought we will gradually reduce what we borrow as we pay. But in 2020, April, consequent to the tax cuts, which reduced government revenue by more than 25%, Sri Lanka got downgraded by global rating agencies. They saw Sri Lanka as being unable to sustainably carry out its debt servicing. With that downgrade, we effectively got blacklisted, which means that we lost access to international financial markets. When we lost that access, now when we repay the debt, we've crippled the balance. You can't go out and borrow to fill up your reserves as you repay. So the reserves have kept coming down speedily. By reserves, it's what is held in the central bank in terms of dollars. Normally, a country to be healthy needs to have more than 3 months or 4 months of reserves, which is what we had in 2019. Today, in an unprecedented decline, by February now, the reserves are down to less than 2 weeks. Never in Sri Lanka's history, Duruthu. Since the central bank was started in 1950, has reserves been reported so low. So it is an unprecedented situation of crisis because the dollar, as long as you keep repaying the debt, without the ability to maintain the balance, you're going to have a shortage. And in order to sort of manage the reserves or reduce the speed with which reserves are coming down, we are clamping down on the availability of dollars for the rest of the economy, which is what the shortage is. We are also forcing banks and people to transact with government at an exchange rate of 200, yes. Right? Yeah. But if the problem for government is that they must really learn to be able to supply dollars at the same price that they demand it. So the government cannot simply buy dollars at 200 and refuse to sell them at 200 or amount close to that. And that is what is driving up the price, because it's okay if the government thought 200 is the right or fair price, but a fair price is a price at which you're willing to buy and sell. That's what a market maker does. They set a fair price, and if the price is fair, you know the price is fair not because somebody tells you so. You know the price is fair if the person who is saying it's fair is willing to act on both sides of the market at that price. If you're only willing to buy at a price and you're not willing to sell at a price, it means it's probably not a fair price.
Does Sri Lanka have only a cash flow issue?
I think what the government has often said is that this is a shortage of dollars. and that the shortage is temporary, and that you could come out of it, once if you figure out this temporary process, and often tourism is cited as a way to come out of it. Now, I think even if that were true at the very early stage of the crisis, I think we've allowed the crisis to snowball in a way that it is no longer true. So I told you reserves were at a historical low, but that is not the only problem in Sri Lanka. I also told you that ratings have come down and we are officially blacklisted. That is also a historical first. Okay, so there are two problems, but there's a third. The third is that the interest, that the government revenue has fallen so much that the interest on debt, interest only, is today in 2020 71% of government revenue. That's not only a record, historical record for Sri Lanka, that is in the world today a record. We can find only one country, Lebanon, that in 2019 had that same interest rate to government revenue, and we know what happened consequently. So really, Sri Lanka has all these crises coming together, and they have, because of a lack of consolidation activity, this has led to a fourth crisis, which is that debt to GDP has increased by 24% in 2 years. And it is at 120% almost of GDP today. And by debt, I mean not only what the central government says it's debt, all sovereign guaranteed debt. Some of them are parked in state-owned enterprises. So never has Sri Lanka's debt been so high. Never has Sri Lanka's debt increased so fast. So when you add up all these things together, you cannot look at it simply as a liquidity problem. It's almost a perfect storm. Right, you have four unprecedented situations coming together and not dealing with it, and the central bank functioning in a way where they're not willing to buy dollars or sell dollars at the same price they're willing to buy, has now aggravated the problem because worker remittances have also dropped. In the last 6 months of 2021, worker remittances fell by 43%. That came in through the system. That was a very important part of the reserves and meeting the balance of payments. And they will probably continue to fall as long as the central bank can't act in a fair way on both sides of the market.
Dr. de Mel, the swaps and the bilateral negotiations and supplier credit financing, things like that, are these helping to plug the situation as now the government is carrying this out? Is this helping the situation?
So all these measures that the government are taking are short-term measures. So they are certainly helping to postpone the day of reckoning. But they are ensuring that when the day of reckoning comes, it will be all the more severe and difficult because you are really borrowing against your own future. So if your situation is not improving and you're borrowing against your future, that means you're going to put your future into greater trouble than the present would have been if you didn't do that. Right? You could have maintained a situation where you suffer more today. It's like what people in the power sector say about power cuts. They say, well, we don't think we will have oil in the future. We can choose to have a little bit of power cuts constantly over a long time, or we can supply power and give you a much larger power cut in the future. So in a way, the swap is a way of taking power from the future and supplying it today. And it sets us up for greater pain as we go forward.
Is Sri Lanka's inflation only import driven?
So inflation certainly has a component that is import driven, and it is import driven for more than one reason. I think global commodity prices and global inflation has also kicked in. But more than that, importers today, because the government isn't supplying dollars at the price it's buying, are forced to go out and buy dollars at a very high price. And so the cost to the importer when they import is not the actual value of the dollar that the government announces, but the 250, 260 rate that's in the informal market. And of course, they have to pass it through the consumer. But if you look at our inflation breakdown, inflation is not only on tradables and not only on imported goods. It's on non-tradables, which means things that are in Sri Lanka, and it's also on things that are produced in Sri Lanka. So we know that we have a shortage of production in the food sector. and the agriculture sector. So it would be incorrect to think that the inflation can be explained entirely or by a large margin by importation alone, but imports certainly contribute to inflation as well.
The oil bill is the largest. It has jumped to $1.2 billion from 2020 to 2021. And many people advocate hedging oil. Is this wise at this juncture?
Yeah. So I think oil, the demand for oil hasn't actually changed very much. It's that 2020 was an unusual year with many lockdowns.
Yeah.
So in fact, from 2019 to 2020, demand for oil fell by 1.3 billion. So the demand hasn't even fully recovered to the level that it was in 2019. Okay, so the oil isn't causing any kind of unusual consequences on the import bill from what Sri Lanka's steady state would be. The question of hedging oil is about hedging the prices. So when prices are low, you try to secure longer term supply. Okay. Of course, Sri Lanka has attempted a hedging instrument in the past. It hasn't gone too well. And I think if you had the sophistication in your bureaucracy, in the kind of people that you engage to work for you, then hedging is one of the instruments that you can use. But I think Sri Lanka's own history of having mismanaged or seem to have gotten a hedging tool quite wrong will create substantial resistance and concern about a hedging deal if you don't first fix your capacity. So really the problem here is not about whether we hedge or not, it's also whether we have the capacity within our bureaucracy to manage the economy well. And when you do that, when you have a professional management system in place, then all these become options as well.
Dr. de Mel, also the reason for the state authorities to not increase the exchange rate or float the dollar is because they think that it will increase inflation. Your thoughts on this?
So, Duruthu, I said earlier that actually as long as the government is not selling dollars at the price it's buying it, okay, those who are importing are buying dollars at perhaps an overinflated rate because there's an acute shortage created by the government's actions, and the inflation consequences of a depreciation are already here with us. Because I don't know any importer who can buy dollars at 200 easily, or there's going to be very little of that. So I think if there is a depreciation of the dollar, and then it's not really going to make a big impact today on inflation because it has already happened, right? Whatever that consequence is. So I think the second side of this question that people often miss is that when you get more rupees for your dollar, this also benefits the exporters. So we also get money in dollars. So if you solve the problem in a way that you increase your inflows, then it reduces the shortage. When it reduces the shortage, it reduces the markup. So the problem now is that by because you've reduced your inflows, you've created a shortage, and of course the price is already very high and you are paying that inflated price. But by increasing what you pay for the dollar a little bit, maybe, if you can reduce the shortage, so the strategy is not just to depreciate the currency, but to work on a strategy, and there has to be multiple strategies. There can't be one single strategy. You can't do this with exchange rates alone. You have to look at your interest rates, you have to look at restructuring your debt, reducing your outflows in various ways. So it's not a single strategy that should be followed, but certainly if you depreciate the currency somewhat in a way that reduces the shortage, gets worker remittances back, and government is able to buy and sell at the rate that it says, the moment that happens, actually you could end up reducing the depreciation from the effective depreciation that is in the market right now. So a clever management approach could actually reduce the inflationary pass-through of the exchange rate as well.
Dr. de Mel, there is still a resistance to this.
So, I can't speak for government and those who advise government, but it is not unusual, Duruthu, in economic decision making to have more than one view. And I think it is quite challenging from a decision maker political perspective to know who to trust. And whose advice to take, and this is a perennial problem, I think, in the political space. But I would say that the outcomes that we are seeing in the country, the power cuts, the fuel shortages, are a sign that the current advice is not delivering the goods.
Yeah. The import-export volumes last year were within the trend. Like import costs were double that of export revenue, and we did not have an issue at the time. Why is there an issue?
When you upset the balance of a system, it can go quite wrong, right? So in the past, we had imports more than exports. So there was a gap in the trade account. But when you looked at your overall current account, overall balance of payments, there were worker remittances covered a large part of that gap.
Yeah.
Okay. So we normally count tourism earnings, though I think it is overinflated what we count as tourism earnings in Sri Lanka. And we had people coming in with investment. There was confidence in the country. So as long as there are other means of inflows to cover the gap, you can manage it. But the moment you create uncertainty in the economy, you create a sense of crisis, which is what has happened, that the government is not in control, is not managing it well, then you find that the outflows, become more than the inflows. That the things that fill that gap of the trade deficit aren't happening anymore.
Yeah. So will floating the dollar help this crisis, to manage the crisis?
Yeah. So let me say one more thing to your previous question.
Yes.
The other thing that has made now different from the past is that we've upset the balance also on the debt payments.
Okay.
So we are paying debt, but we can't borrow. In proportion to that. So the medium-term plan of the central bank was not to borrow 100% of what you pay, but to maybe borrow 90%, and over time bring your foreign debt down. But now we pay 100% and we borrow zero. Now that's a problem. I'm talking about especially the international sovereign bonds, right? That debt instrument is completely off balance. So you have to restore balance. Right. We know that in any environment, let's say if global warming is all about a 2% increase in global centigrade and the consequences of that are enormous. So we mustn't take it lightly that an economic system, like any ecosystem, has to be maintained in balance, right? So your current question is that will floating the dollar increase the inflation. Yeah. So I think it as I said earlier, that has already happened. Yeah, because whether you float the dollar or not, no importers aren't buying the dollar at 200, right? And that has already happened, and imports are not the sum total of your inflation problem also. So I would say it is an overstatement or a misunderstanding if you think that you mustn't not float or adjust the price of the dollar, because that, as I said earlier, it can really help to bring stability to the system. Currently, we are in an unstable situation that is snowballing, and we've got to stop it getting worse.
External sector reserves have shrunk. What, in your opinion, would be the best way to boost those reserves?
So when you're talking about the reserves of the central bank,
yes.
Okay, so this comes back to the problem we are describing, that we are continuing to repay debt while we have lost access to financial markets and we can't borrow. Then we have lost confidence of everybody, including Sri Lankans, so they're not even sending their remittances. So there is only, two ways to, you have to do immediately two things. You have to stop the imbalance, that is, you have to stop outflows on debt payments, which means you have to restructure your debt. That is the immediate step that you should take. You have to restore confidence that the central bank can then, by delaying payments on debt, put itself in a situation that it can supply dollars at the same price that it buys, whatever that price is, that is reasonable and fair, therefore. And then that restores confidence for worker remittances and other things to come in through the system. right? And there's no reason for there to be a shortage and where people pay out. So of course the restructuring will cause pain to creditors, but that's important because you don't want all the pain borne by the Sri Lankan economy. Today, 3.5 hours of power cuts, according to the PUCSL's calculations, cause a 1 billion rupee loss to the economy. When you have a island-wide power cut for 3.5 hours, that's 1 billion rupees. And you can see how the costs are mounting for the economy. People aren't able to do business, people aren't able to be productive, it'll have consequences on exports. So this is a problem that is becoming aggravated. And the sooner we stop the aggravating consequences, which is this enormous unnecessary shortage created by the outflow, that can be suspended in a restructuring process, the faster we will come out of it.
Will debt restructuring be a long-term solution?
Again, it's very hard to know why there's resistance in Sri Lanka, but I could say why there is generally often a delay and difficulty in getting agreement on debt restructure. A country that comes to debt restructure, especially like Sri Lanka, where it's happening for the first time, doesn't have the experience and the know-how and the knowledge of how this happens. So anything that is new and uncertain can cause a certain level of trepidation, worry, uncertainty, and that can make it difficult for policymakers to embark on it as quickly or as fast as they should. So there's a famous maxim within the IMF that describes countries like Sri Lanka, because they've seen it many times. They say it's the phenomenon of too little, too late. Countries need to act faster and do it, but they do too little and do too late. It's very much like people worry about their physical health, right? You wait till you get a little older and you have chronic diseases to start behaving in a healthy way. And it can be too little, too late. You've already reduced your life expectancy rather a lot. So the earlier you act to put your economy back in health, and currently its restructuring is the path back to health, the better off you will be. But the tendency to procrastinate and to feel uncertain because this is something new is also not unusual.
The banking sector has been posting very healthy results, but there is a looming debt moratorium. So what would the future look like for the banking sector?
So I think the banking sector can do well as long as it passes on the pain to their customers. There are no dollars, the bank doesn't have to find the dollars, it just tells the customers, there are no dollars, go find your own dollars, right? Talk to exporters, talk to people outside. So for the banking sector, often the problem can be to some extent passed through. The other way the banking sector can benefit is that the government also, because of the shortage, gets into short-term swap arrangements with the banks. They ask the banks to give the dollars they have and give very, very high interest rates to the banks. So you make a lot of money, but the country will have to pay that back in the future. So we are really mortgaging our future for a sugar high in the present, effectively, and that is what's happening even within the private sector. I think people understand that there are opportunities through the way the government is also functioning for them to benefit from from today, from pain that is pushed to the future. But I think when the pain comes in the future, and is inevitably must, people will regret the outcome. Just like the tax cut of 2019, which reduced government revenue by 25%, was hugely welcomed by the private sector. But that led to the rating downgrade that caused the enormous imbalance and all the problems that we are witnessing now in the economy and the country. So if we had to rewind and say, should we have celebrated the tax cut? Obviously not. But I think short-termism is common, I think, in most, in the human system. But of course, the reason there is technical analysis and studies to understand the danger of short-term thinking and to help countries and governments and companies to take a longer-term view and understand that a little bit of pain today can save a lot of pain tomorrow.
Will tourism revenue save Sri Lanka?
Yeah, so I think there is this idea for also that this is a short-term problem, that when tourists come back, that Sri Lanka will do better. I think that's mistaken for three reasons, right? One is that when tourism bounces back up, it means travel has improved and money flows out of the country, just as money comes into the country when travel improves, and especially in a context like today, when people are trying to hoard up on dollars, the tendency for money to flow out with human people is also quite great. Secondly, tourism already was there in 2017, 18, 19, and tourism helped cover the trade deficit you talked about, but didn't help cover the debt deficit. So we still needed to refinance debt that we paid through debt that we took. So until we get our ratings back up and get access to international markets, tourism can't plug that hole. And thirdly, we may be overestimating actually what we earn from tourism, as I said earlier, because we estimate that we earn $168 per person per night from every tourist that's in the country. That's a family of four. We think we'll be spending $675 a night in the country. But only 11% of the tourists stay in five-star hotels. Even five-star hotels rooms don't cost so much. And when you compare against what other countries estimate they earn from tourists, it's much lower than Sri Lanka. Even Thailand estimates a lower number. European countries estimate lower numbers. Malaysia estimates only 41. So these estimates are poorly done in many countries, and Sri Lanka seems to have done it poorly in a way that has exaggerated the belief that tourism brings in a lot of these revenues. It's quite unlikely that that revenue comes, and even if it came, it always came before, and it doesn't plug the hole that Sri Lanka has by being locked out of international financial markets.
In this crucial time, the authorities and policymakers have the uphill task of putting the country first and making the correct decisions.